Well, hello and welcome. It's been 100 days since Britain's Brexit deal finally kicked in. And given the rioting in Northern Ireland, partly inspired by some of its consequences, the complaints by fisherfolk, exporters, musicians, and others in the creative industries, one thing we can presumably all agree on is it's not yet done. But the Prime Minister made clear in a speech of July 2019 the two aims he set for himself. He said, "Our mission is to deliver Brexit for the purpose of uniting and re-energizing our great United Kingdom and making this country the greatest place on earth." Well, in his first 100 days, Franklin Delano Roosevelt managed to get 15 new bills through the US Congress and began to rebuild the American economy. So in our 100 days, measured by the Prime Minister's own mission statement and language, how far are we united, re-energized, heading towards a global Britain, leveling up, a science superpower, he also said, and the greatest place on earth? Or are we among the gloomsters and the doomsters, as he put it? Well, our top panel to discuss this tonight are Sasha Langeveldt, who's an alum and former Kent Union president, Neva Sadikoglu-Novaky, who's an alum and a Conservative Party member, Professor Jeremy Carrette, who's Dean for Europe, Dr. Miriam Sorachi, who's lecturer in quantitative politics, and Professor Richard Whitman, who's Professor of Politics and International Relations. And throughout this hour, we want your questions. So please send them in and they'll come through to me by the magic of the chat function. At least I hope they will. Let's begin with an overview, if we may. Just going around each of you just for a minute or two, just to tell us from your perspective and your experience and your expertise, where you think we are with Brexit at 100 days. Jeremy, maybe we should begin with you and your perspective as Dean for Europe.
Thank you, Gavin. Yeah, well, we've been preparing for Brexit for many years. Probably from 2016, universities have been in full flow in terms of preparing. Where we are now, of course, is in a very new world, and a world that we're trying to fully grasp. It's the implications. At one level, I think universities are in a world of pragmatic determinism. They're trying to ensure that the world continues because, as we all know, knowledge is relation. And without relationships, without sharing, without community, our knowledge is diminished. We only have to look at the present world we're in. The solutions to the world are about connectivity. Where there are limits to connectivity, then we need to find solutions. And universities are very good at asking questions and finding solutions. That's what their DNA is. So I think the future will always be about trying to find ways through a new system. However, behind that determination to find a solution is, of course, what we've lost. We've lost the mobility of students entering into Europe. We've lost a connectivity in terms of our fee structure. We're going to limit the international access of European students into the United Kingdom. We're also going to set up new barriers for entry in terms of immigration. There are challenges on health insurance, and this is both for colleagues going into Europe and also for other colleagues coming from Europe and students coming from Europe. So there are lots of new barriers. There is, of course, the loss of Erasmus, which is a huge question of student mobility. But there are new schemes, but we need to ask questions about how they will be developed and the kind of funding. So I think it's a time of learning, but I think we're also engaged in a situation of trust building. The European universities are trying to understand what we've done, and we're trying to negotiate solutions on fees and our joint programs. So effectively, 100 days on, we're into a very big new workload of transition and a lot of complications to solve. But we will find a way through. But I think we also keep an eye on what we need to lobby on for what we've lost.
Thank you for that, Jeremy. Neva, from your perspective, where are we with this at 100 days?
Thank you very much, Gavin. I'll be approaching this as someone who's also been a senior European civil servant and spent about a decade of my career so far in the EU. So the way I see it at the moment is it's been a rocky start given the adaptation challenges that we've seen that businesses have faced, especially when we look at the Northern Ireland situation with empty supermarket shelves reported in January, and now the unrest. As you know, we saw 8 consecutive nights of unrest from 2nd of April. So that is clearly marks of a turbulent start to what is ultimately what I would call an evolving story of friends with trade benefits. It's the end of a marriage of almost 5 decades. And I always said, you know, when you had the Brexit referendum, it was going to be a change in the relationship no matter what. So it was going to be redefinition, but it was going to, the outcome of the referendum would define on how it would be redefined. And we're now seeing that attempt to define it as a friends with trade benefits. And we saw that agreement for trade in goods, as you rightly pointed out, come into force on the 1st of January. But it was not quite a complete picture, because as many of us saw as well, the European Atomic Agency had been missed out. So suddenly there was a bit of a panic, and you had the agreement extended to cover the European Atomic Agency at the beginning of this year. On services, which is a major issue, of course, for the UK, we now have a memorandum of understanding. So we'll see how it all evolves. But for me, what is really interesting is to see to what degree we will have pragmatism when it comes to the relationship. And ultimately, I think that's going to be defined by 3 factors. So one of them is the emotions, because this is still a very emotive topic for many, especially civil servants at the heart of the EU, who are in charge of dealing with the legislative and legal text and its interpretation. Secondly, the politics. We've got elections coming up in France and Germany that we must not forget about, which will be key. And then, of course, global events like COVID-19. And I think COVID-19 is actually forcing pragmatism. So what you're seeing is that political actors and leaders, including the Taoiseach from Republic of Ireland, is coming in to actually force pragmatism, to say, you know what, we can't have a vaccine war, because even though we might, you know, as we might see attempts to try to cover all the legal eventualities and make sure that Article 16 is there to block export of vaccines to Northern Ireland, just in case there's smuggling going on, etc. There's no real risk of that happening, and we need pragmatism in the face of COVID-19. So that would be my quick snapshot take on it.
Neva, thank you. Richard, just your opening thoughts. And I just wondered, when listening to Neva, one of the things that obviously happened was we, the British, set deadlines to do certain things without actually having had the negotiations completed. And that's obviously a way of focusing minds. But I wonder if we're paying the penalty for that now, because there's so many loose ends, as Neva and Jeremy rightly pointed out, things that we haven't actually really sorted out yet.
Well, thanks, Gavin. And yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it's worth noting, as Neva did, that COVID really has sort of masked many of what would have been the obvious effects of Brexit anyway. I mean, the ones that hit people personally, as well as the economic effects. So, you know, it's quite difficult actually for us to come to a sort of definitive view as to what the costs might be in the short term. But I think what we're also aware of is that we've entered into a new kind of relationship where it is a relationship of the UK being an outsider with the EU, a third party. And that is not a sort of static process. We didn't do the deal. And then, you know, we entered into a new relationship. What we actually did was we negotiated 2 deals, the withdrawal agreement and then the trade and cooperation agreement, which really just fire the starting gun for a whole series of processes that then kick in, which work through how we're going to relate to one another. And we're seeing those, I think, most acutely at the moment in the relationship between Northern Ireland and the UK, and the effects of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which obviously still hasn't bedded in. But we've also seen some of the effects at the borders in terms of the way that you run a customs relationship when you're outside the EU as a customs union. And there's much more of that to come. Much more of that to come, I think, in terms of areas such as people and the movement of people, because of course we've been very unable to move across borders, and that's going to be something that we will feel acutely as soon as we start to move again. And I think we'll start to feel it, especially in areas such as services and those who are involved in delivering services across borders, where they haven't been able to do many of the sort of physical delivery of services aspects that are normally the case. And that's going to be very different once we start moving around post-pandemic. So the start, I think, of a very complicated, sometimes testy, but ever interconnected relationship.
Yes, that is very interesting, actually. The whole question of interdependence in a somewhat difficult world. Sasha, just your thoughts, and I'll remind everybody watching, please do send in your questions. I've got a few that have come in already, but Sasha, what's your opening thoughts of where we are after 100 days?
I think, in all honesty, I think there's still a lot of uncertainty of what Brexit will look like. And obviously we're going through a global pandemic right now. So the reality of Brexit and the impacts of Brexit are still yet to be seen. And I think when we look at the government and what they've done for students in terms of COVID-19, it's shown that students are often the last thought of. And that's the same when it comes to Brexit negotiations. We saw where the government said that they wouldn't pull out of the Erasmus program, and then yet we had another U-turn, and they did pull out. And I think that goes to show how the government actually doesn't necessarily think about students' opportunities when doing the negotiations for Brexit or passing policy in terms of what is best for students. So I think, you know, it's uncertain of what the impacts of Brexit will look like. And I think there's a lot of distrust in the government as it stands right now. We came into, you know, a Brexit that was based on lies. And I don't think that students as well as young people are fully supportive of the government as we stand. So I think we're still waiting to see the real impacts of what Brexit will have on students as well as young people.
Thank you. Miriam, from your perspective, where are we, do you think?
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Gavin. So I'm focusing a bit more on public opinion, and I was, you know, looking through the surveys, especially over the past couple of months. And what I think is particularly interesting in this period, as you know, a number of the panelists have already mentioned the effect of the pandemic. I mean, Brexit was the top issue, the most important issue straight after the referendum, until basically the beginning of last year. And then we see this massive drop in, you know, whether people think that Brexit should be at the top of our minds or at the top of the government agenda at all. At the moment, it's like a fourth ranked issue, and it's at 26%, whereas after the referendum, it was consistently hovering around 70% of people thinking it's a very important issue. It's the most important issue. So it's a decreasing salience, definitely, of the Brexit issue, which it's definitely due to the pandemic. Partly, we saw this drop also starting from the 31st of January 2020, Brexit Day. So there is a decrease, a massive decrease in salience in the minds of people. The economy and healthcare are definitely at the top of the list right now. But at the same time, what I find particularly interesting is that public opinion is still polarized, is still deeply divided over Brexit. So there is a decrease, massive decrease in salience. Brexit is not the top issue by any means, but leavers and remainers still disagree over what the economy looks like. Also, people are still divided over whether it was a right or wrong decision. And if we were to hold a referendum right now, we wouldn't see a massive majority to remain. And even less to rejoin, because the most likely scenario right now would be a referendum to rejoin, and that has even less support. So that I find sort of interesting, but of course there are divisions between leavers and remainers again. So, you know, public opinion still polarized. We don't have a clear consensus emerging over whether Brexit was wrong or right, actually the vaccination program seems to be ticking in favor of Brexit, but still public opinion very, very much polarized and divided. And then a third thing, and the final thing that I want to say that we're noticing in the latest public opinion polls is that favoring, you know, that it's in Scotland in particular, the independence referendum is gaining momentum. This started in the fall 2020, but there is now, consistently in the polls, like majorities in Scotland for pro-independence. And then also in Northern Ireland, a razor-thin majority. So again, a divided public opinion in Northern Ireland in favor of a border poll. So these are the three things, like drop in salience, massive drop in salience of the Brexit issue, but still polarization and division, and also the likelihood that these independence movements within the UK might be gaining grounds.
Miriam, just let me pick up one thing, because everybody's sort of touched on it in different ways, which is it's a work in progress, and also coronavirus, as Neva rightly said, has been in all our minds. So when, as we all hope, please, coronavirus recedes and we think about going on holidays, or do you think some of those things will strike home, because it will be very different perhaps for traveling to Spain or France or wherever we're going on our summer holidays, not just because of coronavirus, but because of just the changes that Brexit has brought about?
I think it's likely. I think it's likely that as the pandemic recedes, then we will be much more able to see the economic impacts that are specific to Brexit. Right now, with all of the economic impacts that we're seeing, the image is a bit muddy. But I mean, I think so, because at the moment there is still division on how leavers and remainers interpret the economy, for example. I was looking at the 20th wave of the British election study, and therefore what makes me think, a lot of people would say, oh yeah, Brexit, nobody cares about it anymore, and they've seen what the government can do when the economy really goes badly, so they will say Brexit, or whatever, we can pay for it. But actually we still see a division there, a divided public opinion, and so it is likely that when it is clearer, when the pandemic and those effects go away, it might very well be that then public opinion shifts towards, if the economic impact is bad and the government cannot recoup that. It also depends on what the government does, right? But definitely, I would still see into the future a deep polarization there, right? Of people wanting to see what they want to see according to their stance on Brexit.
Thank you. A lot of questions come in. There's one, I think, for probably Sasha first. What prospects for UKC corporately, the Students' Union, to join a concerted campaign with pro-EU groups to reinstate Erasmus and so on? How may we rejuvenate the young European society? In other words, what would be the role of students and Students' Union going forward? Because obviously those things affect students in particular. Sasha.
What I would say is, first of all, speak to your student representatives. So speak to your Students' Union president that's currently standing, Aisha. And what I would say is the only way that the union can, for example, support something like, for example, People's Vote that we had done in the past, is if we do a vote and students vote on it and it passes policy to become a union policy. Because as a students' union, we do have to remain apolitical. But in terms of a People's Vote, it wasn't tied to a specific party, which that meant that we could campaign on behalf of it. And also what I'd say is get involved with the NUS, as well as other organizations that are fighting for, rights for students, such as I campaigned a lot with For Our Future's Sake. And I think it's still something that shouldn't just be passed off just because there are some other schemes that the government are pushing or shoving forward because of the loss of Erasmus. I think people should still campaign for the support of rejoining Erasmus, because it offers so much opportunities, especially for students who can't afford, the expenses that come with the other program. So speak to your Students' Union and mobilize. And when I say mobilize not only online and social media, because social media has an effect of a progressive society, I always say. So we need to mobilize on the streets, get your MP, local MP on board as well, and start writing letters and pushing through some serious change. And I think Jeremy has something to say on that.
Thank you. The question, Jeremy, was actually from Jonathan Harris. I should have said so. So have a go, Jeremy.
Yeah, I think Sasha's right. I think that there are going to be many later reflections on the loss of Erasmus, but the picture is moving very quickly. And I think we need to also recognise that what the Welsh government has done in creating a 65 million fund for mobility. And remember that the Turing scheme that's been set up is only for outgoing mobility. And at the moment, of course, that's going to be stretched across the world, that 110 million fund. So I think that there are going to be regional distinctions here between the reactions to the mobility schemes that we have. And if we see that other European countries will set up their own in outbound structures to coming to the UK, and we may also see a disproportionate students going to Ireland because the English speaking opportunities are also relevant there. So I think that we need to recognize this is a mobile situation. We're going to enter a very different world. And the kind of end result will then require the specific kinds of new lobbying. And I'm probably, as Richard and I have talked about the significance of Norway. Norway reintroduced new aspects in its relationship to the EU gradually over time. And I think that we'll be seeing the incorporation of very specific protocols for different parts of legislation. And I think that education will be one aspect of that.
There's a related question, Neva, put to you from Andrew Colvin. He says, what steps can be taken to minimize the cultural damage intensified by COVID of estrangement from Europe? And I know from friends who are in the theatre business and musicians and so on, who used to be able to tour in Europe quite easily. They're now finding it, not just with COVID, they're very, very concerned that there will be big cultural damage to our country by their inability to go the way they used to. Neva.
No, thank you, Gavin, for that question. Look, I think we have to balance out perception with reality, and also just keep in mind at the moment that, as you pointed out as well, with COVID-19, unfortunately, many of us are not going anywhere at all. I remember the days when I was in my job in the EU, I was traveling all across Europe. Nowadays, I'm traveling from my kitchen to the living room and possibly the park if I'm lucky, and that's just about it. So there is that factor, but I think also the reality of it, so perception versus reality. You do have systems in place for travel, so for business travel, a sort of visa liberalization of some sort. So it's not that you don't really lose your right to go across in any way. And again, I think also when it comes to students, it's really important to remember the new Turing scheme that's been introduced as well. And look, someone who benefited from Erasmus, I really enjoyed my Erasmus year in Paris. It was fantastic. So, but I was really encouraged to see the Turing scheme with £100 million dedicated to it. So I think, Gavin, we have to see how this evolves. But again, I don't think that I don't think we stop being European. You know, we are European, even if we're not part of the EU. And as many will be able to tell from my surname, I'm English, Turkish, proud of both identities. And, you know, the Council itself confirmed Turkey's European identity when it launched the accession process, because that's how EU accession processes work. So Turkey is a non-EU country, but a European country, as is Norway, as is Iceland, as is Switzerland. None of those countries are any less European just because they're not a member of the EU. And I think that is something we have to remember. But I do hope that also on the some challenges from the Belgian authorities, who were not making it very easy for Brits to retain their permanent residency rights in Belgium. And we're hearing stories like that from across Europe. So I think it's really important that, you know, we keep level-headed about this. We try to keep that dialogue going on both parts to our best abilities to make sure a smooth implementation, and where possible, we keep tweaking and improving the agreements so that we don't end up with an estrangement of any kind.
Richard, what extent do you think that the British government will have to be discussing this then for not just months to come, but perhaps several years to come? I mean, some of this is very detailed. I know that one of the things, I mean, it is true that people can go to Europe, of course, when COVID permits, but things like work permits and also cabotage, you know, having to pay, having lorries which can only make 2 drops of scenic equipment and so on, and then have to come back to Britain where people are used to doing tours. So there is a cultural impact which has not really been thought through.
No, absolutely, Gavin. And if you look at the agreements themselves, I mean, they actually have within them Lots of bits of unfinished business. There are grace periods for some areas and for some sectors. There are transitional arrangements in place, which means that there is supposed to be periods to allow for adjustment for some parts of business and so on. There are some unsettled negotiations, and a really important one in this area is the recognition of professional qualifications, UK professional qualifications in the EU, which is those negotiations haven't started, but clearly they're very important in terms of mobility. And there are reviews built into the existing agreements, of which probably the most well known is the requirement for a consent vote in Northern Ireland on the Northern Ireland Protocol in 2024. So, the UK government can't just step back and say, look, this is done. We made this agreement and we're dusting off our hands and getting on to something else. We are locked into a dynamic of continuing negotiation with the EU, even on the terms that we agreed to leave and on the trade and cooperation agreement. And then, as Jeremy has suggested, there are a whole set of other issues that we may want to revisit as we find the relationship unfolds. Perhaps one thing to note, though, is that the British government has decided that in terms of the sort of broader ambition for the relationship, it doesn't want to state what its ambition is, because if you look at the integrated review, that covers the future of Britain's foreign security, development and defence policy, the EU barely features, which is extraordinary when you think that it is our neighbourhood, and obviously we have an invested interest in good relationships with our neighbours and our security with those. But that's not going to disappear, and I think that's when the electoral politics issues start to kick in, and some of the things that Miriam has touched on. When it starts to come back into the public consciousness, is it the public that starts to push for some kind of change relationship, upgrading or alteration in what we currently have agreed?
I hope you can again. I'm afraid I lost pictures and lost everyone there. Can you still hear me? Nope. I hope you can hear me. Yes, this is slightly difficult because I can't hear anybody for some reason.
Oh, sorry, I think I was on mute. I said you're fine.
Thank you. There's a lovely question from someone who wished to remain anonymous, and I think it should be for Miriam, which goes: should all future constitutional changes in Britain be subject to a 2/3 majority? I'm not sure if any of the polling that you've seen suggests that, but there's certainly been a considerable unhappiness about how we take these great changes and whether we have a constitution that makes any sense to normal people without actually looking at it as if it's something that's written in some kind of ancient tongue. So what do you think? Do you think there would be some demand, if we have future constitutional changes, for a 2/3 majority?
Well, it is tricky. I mean, I agree that this is a constitutional issue. It's, and in some countries like Italy, for example, where I come from, you cannot put such issues like international treaties to a referendum, actually. So different countries organize this differently. And it's a tricky issue, and you want to have broad consensus. But the issue is that the UK is a fundamentally majoritarian system. The constitution is an unwritten constitution, and the doctrine here is of parliamentary sovereignty. In the end, the referendum was merely advisory, right? The parliament has sovereignty. It's not really the constitution in the sense of like having a rigid constitution like the US. It's a very, very different system. So that would require basically changing, completely overhauling the institutional framework of the UK. So I see that as being very, very difficult to actually do. I'm not sure if there would be any kind of majority for changing basically the nature of the UK political system. I'm not a political theorist, but I've heard arguments like that for issues of constitutional importance, think about, for example, the Catalonia case in Spain. There are issues around, what kind of majority do we want for issues like that? And definitely certain countries who have a written constitution and a rigid constitution would say for such changes, you need at least 2/3 or you need 2 votes, but again, this goes into the nature of the political system. So it would be really, really tricky to implement here.
And Richard, whatever we make of the Constitution, it may be changed by some of the things that Miriam alluded to earlier in terms of public opinion in Scotland. We're going to see those elections in May, and what's going on in Northern Ireland. So, I mean, in other words, that we may be discussing over the next 5 to 10 years, not just all the ins and outs of Brexit itself, but some of the knock-on implications for the unity of the United Kingdom.
No, absolutely. And, Miriam made the point, about the low level of saliency of the EU in sort of electoral politics in the UK. That's obviously not even across the UK, where there are different sentiments in Scotland, for example, but also where this is now wrapped into electoral politics and the electoral politics for the Scottish Parliament. I think the interesting question for the UK is the extent to which it's able to sort of negotiate a way forward in which it's able to sort of resolve what are clearly profound differences that cut across sort of public opinion, but also ones which have a sort of embeddedness within the constituent nations of the UK, and whether there's a way that you can resolve that, not just through constitutional arrangements, but through the party political system in the UK, because of course Westminster parties, their writ doesn't run in the same way that it did in the past in Scotland, for example, and it looks likely to be the case that we're going to have a more complicated situation in Wales after the elections that we'll have there. So, what's going to be the sort of the glue that holds the UK together on the political scene, and what conclusions will some parties draw from that they should basically retreat from politics in Wales, or retreat from politics in Scotland, or sort of redouble their efforts to sort of re-establish themselves as genuinely unionist parties. And I don't think we've seen much of that playing out. There's been a lot of focus on sort of Scottish nationalism, Scottish National Party, but I think there's been less of a focus on what the implications might be for the UK unionist parties like Labour and the Conservative Party, and the Liberal Democrats, of course.
Celia Wiedeking has sent a question. I'm German and did all my degrees in the United Kingdom, including at the University of Kent. I valued the international and open character of British universities. Now it feels like Europeans aren't welcome anymore unless they're able to pay overseas fees. How will universities maintain, i.e. get their open and European culture back? Maybe you could begin with Sasha on that, because that's, I mean, one of the great things about the university has been the diversity of our student body, hasn't it? I mean, as well as our academic body. But Sasha.
Thank you, Gavin. Exactly what you said. One of the last things that I did as president in terms of Brexit on our campus was to create it was a solidarity march for our European academics, our European students, and for that it was to show that you are forever welcome. But I feel like the sense that people are not welcome in the UK is increased, and it's something that we can't deny. Even though the UK offers so many opportunities, we can't deny that the UK is no longer a welcoming place for people who are from European heritage, and I think what it means is that, for example, the University of Kent, it was seen as the European university. And I think, I can speak candidly now because I've, left the union as well as university, but I feel like the university really did miss out on a shot on being potentially pro-European, for example, and supporting the European staff in the ways that they needed to in this transition. And I do feel like the sense on campus, it was divided as Brexit was, but in my role as president, I not only had to support students with a British passport, but I had to support students, regardless of the passport that they held. And that put me in a very unique position because of Brexit. It was very divided, but I could sense that European students definitely felt that, in some cases they didn't feel welcome and opportunities were being taken away from them and vice versa. So I feel like we will have to go on a long way to get that culture change back. And I'm not too sure how we're going to start doing that, if I'm honest.
Jeremy wants to come in on that. Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I go entirely along with Sasha saying that we missed the opportunity. I think that we remain an inclusive and international organization in our outlook. And I think that what we have done is to build a global perspective, which sees the European as a part of a global society. And we've built a new program of Kent in Europe to underline a whole series of new sets of relationships. We've established a new regional network with Northern France and Belgium, and we've established new research networks and opportunities. So I think that it's not that we've lost our international outlook. I think it's that we've been presented by the government with a scheme and a framework by which we have to now channel our international vision within. And that's not something by choice. But I think that this relates to wider issues, not about specifically Kent, but about how we develop societies which are inclusive and diverse and equal. And that's a complex picture for the wider society, and ensuring that political decisions don't obfuscate the necessity that we need to constantly work for greater inclusivity in all parts of society. And I think when we've got those changes in place, we'll then be able to sort of see our European connections in a wider set of relationships, because I think we've worked very hard to try and ensure that we've supported our European students and colleagues. But I have to say one point on this. I think we've lost trust. And I think that one of the pieces of work that I've been doing in Europe with our European partners is actually to make it clear that we are working and wanting to find solutions. And what they are experiencing is a confusion and saying, do you still want the connections with us? And we're working hard to rebuild that trust, because our message is knowledge is about connectivity.
Neva, I just wondered what your thoughts are on that, because obviously having great universities, a wonderful kind of soft power around the world that you acknowledged when we began our discussions. But if the vision is global Britain, you could say, looking back on the last year or two, that we've irritated our European partners. And because of our problems with Ireland, we've irritated Joe Biden. We don't get on particularly well with the Russians. Relations with China are extremely difficult. So you start cutting out different bits of the globe that Britain has irritated, and therefore the global Britain idea seems to be shrinking.
Gavin, I guess my perspective is a bit different. As someone who spent a decade of their career in Brussels, someone who's worked in DC, and someone whose current job requires me to work on Africa and Middle East. So I see it much more, not just from a UK perspective, but also from a European EU perspective, because from the EU side as well, the EU has also rubbed people up the wrong way. I think it really is a little bit like, and this is why I kind of use the analogy of friends with trade benefits and that end of a relationship, because there was definitely mutual frictions along the way. There was mutual annoyance along the way. And I think one thing that really demonstrates it is, and I found this really interesting when I was working in the EU, because it was one of those moments, aha moments for me. It was at the time when David Cameron was Prime Minister, and we were having the discussions about the fiscal compact within the EU. So it was really the post-Eurozone crisis, and what does the EU do? How does it come out of it? And at the time, I was working as an advisor in the European Parliament, and one of my colleagues, actually, he was also at the University of Kent, and he'd been the president of the Politics and IR Departmental Society before I was the president a few years back. But he was working as a diplomat, and I remember he was going into the council working groups, and we were having a chat, and he turned around to me and he said, Neva, you know what, the only way I can explain the fact that David Cameron at over 2 a.m. at some point used his veto to help us address the Eurozone crisis is that the UK is trying to jeopardize the whole European project. And he wasn't the only one saying that. I mean, we saw this in the media, there was this discourse. So I think it's just important to remember that it is a mutual kind of rubbing each other up the wrong way, a mutual kind of course of not seeing eye to eye. And in a way, sometimes you say maybe divorce is better than being uncomfortable bedfellows. So it's just a case, I think, rather than having that Groundhog Day of having the same debates over and over again, which I think we've all had in private and professional settings, to say, right, this is where we are. How can we now make this work? And I think there is a will, and I do really see that will, Gavin. As I mentioned, the point about how the issue with regards to vaccines was solved, and we just had news recently also about the trade issue, because the trade complications, whether it's rules of origin complication, which, as you know, so goods that are coming from the EU into England, for example, and then going to Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland is considered as part of the EU single market, there is an issue that those goods are not then subject to zero tariff. So that's a major problem and disruptor. And the second point, of course, being that burden with regards to many food products, with regards to sign-offs from vets, for example, health certificates. Now the Commission, and so both European parties and the UK, they've both said that they're trying to find a way around it, because initially the UK said they would extend the grace period so as not to further exacerbate a situation in Northern Ireland that was clearly very problematic and very fragile and causing a lot of grief and understandable grief given the instability. They said that they would try to find a solution around the implementation. So there is a will around these points. And I guess, call me a millennial optimist. But when I look at the 9/11 situation and the fact that post 9/11 economic recovery has still been very unbalanced in the world, and when I look at the impact that COVID-19 is having now, I just think there is united interest within the West, if I can phrase it that way, to come together to address these points. And you see Biden recommitting the US to addressing these points as well. And clearly there is divergence on how to address some of the, how to term the adversaries, who is the international adversary now, how does NATO redefine itself, etc. I think there's a lot of work to be done, and we need to knuckle down and get on with it.
Miriam, there's a question from Adam Lashinsky, who says, while it seems unlikely we will see the UK rejoin the EU within our lifetime, how likely does the panel think the UK might rejoin certain European programs such as the EFTA or even the EU Customs Union? I mean, is there any polling on any of that maybe that part of the discussions in the future will be at least a warmer structural relationship with the EU, if not actually membership?
Right, yeah. So I haven't seen any recent polling done on that. That seemed like sort of that those things were polled when those issues were still being debated, right? Which sort of Brexit do you want? Is it soft? Is it? And I have done a previous presentation around that time, and I think the majority of those studies they did citizen assemblies as well, or traditional polls. And no matter which type of, method you used, a lot of, public opinion seemed to go towards a soft version of Brexit. But then the problem with EFTA, like the problem with a Norway deal is fundamentally that you would need to be bound by regulations from the EU. And this is, I think, a key reason. I mean, there were other reasons, of course, why leave won, but the sovereignty, the taking back control is certainly a core issue. And if you're part of a Norway deal, I mean, it's not a coincidence that, Norway or Switzerland Switzerland has a series of bilateral agreements, but Switzerland is sort of closer to Norway, I think, right? And it is no coincidence that public opinion in those two countries is really Eurosceptic. So it's because basically you're taking a lot of the regulations without having a say. And that is, I mean, I agree with Theresa May when she said, that would defeat the purpose, right? So why would we exit at all? And so I don't know. I mean, the prospects of rejoining, as I said, the YouGov poll recently, it's 42% would vote to rejoin and 40% would not. And there is like around 18% of unknown or undecided. So I don't know if in our lifetime is not possible. Let me put it that way. I see sort of, the Norway deal as being unlikely. The other thing to say is that right now, rejoin, 42% is a sizable group, and you could, maybe influence the 18% that is still undecided. But against that, I would say, Britain is entering now the situation in which it has to enter these agreements with the EU, these trade agreements. And there's also an argument to be made that British public opinion would also potentially become more Eurosceptic, because it will see what it means to be a country that is fighting these trade battles with a bloc that is huge. And so I don't know, right? Prediction is very difficult. So there is an argument to be made about, rejoin is still, 42% is still a sizable group. I don't see a lot of arguments for the Norway deal right now. But I could also see the argument.
Satisfy anybody, would it? I mean, the implication is it wouldn't satisfy anyone. If you want to rejoin, you're not going to be happy with it. If you didn't want to be in part of it, you're certainly not going to want Norway, are you? I guess that's the problem. Let me bring in Richard again. This is a question from Tom Spear, who basically is talking about question marks about Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, which we've alluded to earlier. Is it time to review the British political model, moving towards a federal model of government? And could this work? I mean, this has been, well, as we know, from home rule all round in the 19th century, this has been talked about and discussed for many a year. But it doesn't, am I right? Whatever the rights and wrongs of it, it doesn't quite engage the public, does it, to talk about federalism?
No, you're absolutely right. It doesn't. And, we also have, some sort of curious blanks in our own history. I mean, we don't spend a lot of time reflecting on the fact that, the Irish Republic left the UK, which was an all-consuming issue in British politics for 50 years. And that's something that generally gets wiped out of most people's consciousness. I think that generally in the UK, constitutional questions don't tend to move people. We now know, as Miriam suggested, that identity questions move people a lot. And that's one of the big divides now in British politics. So if you get constitutional questions and identity questions wrapped up with one another, as you do in Scotland, then they do tend to move, and they do tend to exercise people. And I think the interesting question is what's going to happen to this pro-EU sentiment. Is it going to be something that finds a home? So the question of identity and identification with the European Union translates into a party political identity, or you find that people align in those ways, or they don't. And I think that's probably going to be a big question for the Labour Party, which is going to be under more pressure, I think, to work through what its position is on the future relationship with others. But I think none of the political parties in the UK are going to be under major pressure on sort of federal or constitutional questions along those lines, unless, of course, Scotland looks as if we have a sort of stalemate with the Westminster government on whether you have a referendum or not on Scottish independence. And I think that is then when you see these kind of issues start to rise up in terms of public consciousness, because the alternatives, for example, as we've already seen on Northern Ireland, where you start to redraw barriers across the Irish Sea, they're complicated enough. So the idea of drawing those, in the north of England with Scotland, would feel for most people horrendous. So they may be dragged along the road of thinking about a new constitutional settlement.
I just wanted to pick up that last point. There's a kind of paradox here, though, isn't there? Which is that England is, I don't want to offend anybody, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, but it's the most important part of the Union, and that it's 80% of the population. And yet it's the one place that's thought least about what Scottish independence would mean. And as you mentioned, the fact that Ireland, 26 counties, seceded from the Union is not really mentioned in our political dialogue very much. Whereas Scots and people in Northern Ireland in particular have thought about the consequences of a UK breakup much more than most people in England. Is that right?
I think it's right. I mean, I could point people to your book, of course, where you do
wise thing to do.
rehearse this issue, available from many online booksellers. But I mean, it is an absolutely fascinating question, I think, the sort of questions of blindness in UK politics, but also where English identity goes. Because if you buy into the idea that English identity has been increasingly defined, or was defined, or reinvigorated by a sort of oppositionism to Brussels, where does it go next? How does it articulate itself? And you know, the breakup of the Union of the United Kingdom clearly is a great threat to those who have seen the coincidence of the UK and Englishness as being one and the same thing, and so perhaps aren't prepared, you know, politically and perhaps personally, psychologically, for what the implications of Scottish independence would be for the UK and for England, and that would require an awful lot of political growing up, I think, that I'm not sure the English are prepared for.
There's a question, I think this is for Neva, from Ken Duckett. It's about trade, really. I'll just try and sub-edit it quickly. Can the UK realistically afford to lose trade in terms of loss of exports that we're seeing now, even given stockpiling pre-Brexit? A loss at half the level that we're seeing now would more than wipe out any capital benefit from not paying membership. And that's related to another question, Neva. Dover is the fourth, this is from Alan Smith, Dover is the fourth most economically deprived area in Kent. Is Brexit going to adversely affect its long-term economic prospects? So it's just the wider economy and also the economy of this region, because Dover is very important, obviously, for all of us. What do you think, Neva?
Yeah, of course, gosh, Dover is very important. Look, so I wonder, if I can take it back really quickly to that territorial impact assessment dimension that I mentioned, you know, that unequal, that divide between the poorest and richest regions widening after the financial crisis, but not just in the UK. This is among the OECD countries. So you see that divide widened. And COVID is definitely not helping that. Now, to what degree is Brexit going to be a factor in this? I don't think it will be, because the UK government is coming in with measures to support localities. So within the EU, 1/3 of the EU's budget was dedicated to the EU cohesion policy, for example. But at the same time, the UK was a net beneficiary, and the UK is basically making sure that there is a smooth transition. And obviously debates need to continue about what the future of some of those policies look like. So I do consider myself a localist, Gavin, and I have published on the issue of localities and local development, and I have championed for fiscal devolution as a ways of addressing that. But that is a debate to follow, and we'll see how it goes. On the topic of trade, I think what is important to look at, and I thought this might come up tonight, so I did sort of refresh my stats a little bit before I came along. And what I did is I just did a quick comparison, looking actually at the value of the trade agreements we have at the moment. So import and export, which is the 66 non-EU countries plus the trade and cooperation agreement with the EU, compared to the EU-UK trade that was in place. And what you actually see is that the worth of the trade of the 66 plus the EU is £890 billion, whereas UK-EU was just £668 billion. Now, it's also quite important to remember that the EU was exporting more to us than we were exporting to them. There's always an adaptation process with every agreement. Obviously, you know, fisheries is one of those challenging areas that emerged and really kind of held up the negotiations towards the end. I mean, personally, I would like to see more free trade. I would like to see a more pragmatic approach also from the European side, as I've mentioned. But I think that will also be colored by things like, you know, I won't take up too much time, but I thought it was really fascinating that in 2017 in April, the Eurobarometer survey showed that there were 7 EU countries that trusted the EU less than the UK did, which also, you know, ultimately does explain that sort of very sort of insecure approach, if I can put it that way. We were sort of, you know, hitting an insecurity within the EU without meaning to do so perhaps at the time. So, and among those countries was also France, Italy and Spain, who together make up about half of the EU's economy and size. So those are the kind of things to also keep in mind. But I think, going forward, hopefully we will see greater pragmatism, a more open approach to having stronger free trade ties, and more cooperation when it comes to WTO as well, so that we can trade with Africa and other parts of the world.
Thank you. Sasha, we've only got a couple of minutes left. I just wondered your sort of just a kind of wrap up thoughts of where we are now and where we might go. What do you think? I mean, are you among the gloomsters and doomsters, or how are you feeling about this now?
If I'm honest, I feel like we have already made our bed and we will lie in it, whether or not that's positive or negative. And I feel the way that we've gone, I think it's no longer about what is best for the UK, but it is more about pride than anything else. And I feel like, in my personal honest opinion, that, a lot of young people think that Brexit is going to negatively impact our futures for God knows how many years. And we will be the ones most impacted. And a lot of the people in the politics right now are not looking out for our best interest. They're either trying to save face or compete to whatever this national identity looks like. But for example, me, I hold a British passport, but when we look at Brexit, there's not enough conversations about the xenophobia that also led to whether or not people voted in favor of leave or remain. And just to give you a personal experience, I'm not European, but yet I'm told to go back to Africa when I speak on the subject of Brexit. So, just to give you an example of what we are facing in the UK, and, when we have these conversations about is the UK welcoming when it comes to Brexit, the answer is no. And I don't necessarily know how we're going to move forward with that conversation. But I would be interested to see what the government have in plans for students, because we see the Turing scheme, and we only see the government putting only a year's worth of funding into that. So we need to still have answers for what does the future look like for students and what does the future look like for young people. And I think there's still a lot of uncertainty about that.
And Jeremy, just a final question, which I think will be on all our minds. It comes from Tony Addison. He says, given that UKC had positioned itself quite well as Britain's European university, how will Brexit affect that initiative in the future? And you've touched on it right at the start, but I thought it would be an appropriate place to end. How do you see the next year or two? Because there are going to be quite a few difficulties, aren't there?
Yeah, I think inevitably that there are challenges of perception, but Europe is in the DNA of the university. It was one of the earliest participants in the pilot scheme for Erasmus, and our locality defines that identity. And I think it's important to recognise that the local council, Kent County Council, set up a Strait Committee to link with the local governments in northern France and Flanders. And the university system is embedded within that. So our regionality will always mean that we have a very special link to our European neighbours. And there are new sort of possibilities of building those relationships in different ways. And that's why I started on the word pragmatism. I think there's a lot of discussion and there's a lot of change to come, but we need to keep talking and keep trying to change the agenda so that education benefits all.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. And thanks to all of you who sent in questions. While I'm speaking to you from the Kent coast, and a good day like today, we can actually see France. So to go back to Jeremy's original point, we remain connected, whether that connectivity is working entirely brilliantly like my internet connection, I'm not so sure. But thank you very much for joining us. And again, thanks to all the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin.
Thank you.